Good morning, average engineers. Today I wanted to give you some cost-saving tips for Databricks users and data teams. I think it comes to a point eventually, no matter who you are or how big the team you're working on is, if you're working on Databricks platform at all, we pretty much drink that Kool-Aid of Databricks. We get mad, crazed. We're like cult followers. We froth at the mouth. We plow our minds and energies into the Databricks until there's nothing left to give. And then at some point, our bosses circle around and say, hey, your guys are spending too much money. And so today, that's what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about some basic cost-saving measures for Databricks workloads and environments. There's nothing fancy, and there is no secret sauce, no snake oil here, just plain old common sense. No snake oil, just cost savings. I do get this question a lot from some people, and I think it's not uncommon for people to think that there's some special sauce or unicorn glitter they can just sprinkle on your Databricks setup and it's going to result in 80% cost savings. And that's rarely the case, honestly. Now I'm just going to go through these cost-saving tips in no particular order, and they're very basic, so if you don't know much about them, just look them up later, and I'll just give you a quick overview of each one. Now the first set of tips have to do with Delta Lake specifically. Delta Lake is the storage API that is behind Databricks. That's what everybody uses if you're on Databricks most likely, and there's a couple things that can help you save money on your Delta Lake tables. Two of them are maintenance. They're called Optimize and Vacuum. Optimize is where you compact small files into the perfect size, usually small files up into a little bit bigger, and it's probably one of the most common performance problems encountered in Spark. You can see it even when you're running notebooks in Databricks. It'll tell you, hey, you're reading too many small files. You need to compact these files. So basically what you need to do for extra cost savings on large tables, especially when you get terabytes plus, you need to optimize basically probably on a daily basis whatever new data is coming in. You don't need to optimize the entire table if it's partitioned, right? You can just pick up the new partitions and kind of optimize that subset of that table. Probably you should on a daily basis if you have a large amount of data coming in. This will speed up queries a lot and save money. Then of course there's a vacuum. It's another important part of Delta Lake that you should basically run vacuum, and it basically deletes and removes unused and unreferenced files. For example, from the transaction log, I think the default retention is 7 days, so just look into that as well. Okay, the next two cost-saving tips are not huge, but they're really just about dealing with tech debt and making sure your systems are up to date. So one of the things people forget about is that you can upgrade DBR versions, Databricks runtime versions. They change this version quite often, actually. And many of these DBR upgrades that Databricks put out, they have a lot of speed improvements, say like for merge statements, with new DBR versions that get a lot faster. There's all sorts of stuff they do in those DBR versions to make things run quicker on Databricks, and if you're using a super old one, you need to regularly be upping your DBR versions to get those latest speed improvements. And another one you might hear some people talking about that you need to try out is something called Photon. It's like the quiet hero of Databricks. It's not talked about a ton, but it can lead to pretty big speed ups on certain jobs. It's basically a high performance Databricks native vectorized query engine that runs your SQL workloads. So you just try out Photon, see if it makes your job faster. If the overall job runs a lot quicker on Photon, then you're going to save money. We're going to talk about some things to actually save, like bottom line compute dollars, the amount you spend on compute. Another big one is liquid clustering. It's around Delta Lake. Delta Lake's kind of moving away from like the classic Hive table partitions to more liquid clustering. I did an article on it and saw massive speed improvements. I think other people have seen the same thing. So if you're not using liquid clustering on your Delta Lake tables, you should do that because it will save you time and money on your queries. Absolutely, it will. The next area that I see a lot of people ignore that's super obvious is just tune your cluster size. It's so obvious, and it's a serious way to save money if you just go review all your jobs and code that are running and make sure you're looking at those Spark logs, the Spark UI, and just saying, am I wasting resources? Can I tune these cluster size to meet the jobs? Because a lot of time people set up new jobs and they just use what was there before or whatever. They don't put a lot of time into it. Probably 80% of people do that. So if you go back, look at all your jobs running and make sure you're not wasting resources. Maybe set auto cluster resizing, basically go look at those clusters and jobs that are running and say, am I wasting things? Do I need to retune these sizes of this cluster to match what this job is actually doing? Something I maybe probably didn't do in the beginning or might have not known. Another huge cost-saving measure that people never think about and never take on is reducing the all-purpose cluster usage. This is a big deal because there's like a 50% cost difference between jobs and all-purpose clusters, and a ton of people use all-purpose clusters, especially if you're on big teams with data scientists and data analysts. Everyone's got their own all-purpose cluster running, doing this and that. maybe run a little bit of data and got some massive terabyte cluster running, you can seriously burn a ton of cash using these all-purpose clusters. You need to be smart about it. Again, not everyone needs their own all-purpose cluster. You need to play around with notebooks all day, fine. Just make one all-purpose cluster that's reasonably sized that everyone can share. Big money savings there. And also just teach people how to develop locally instead of going to a notebook by default in Databricks and just burning compute for no reason. The next two cost-saving tips are just really general big data and Spark optimization ideas. They're probably one of the hardest ones to deal with. They're probably going to make them more time, but you can get some decent cost savings out of them. One is just doing the Spark jobs. So basically start with the 80-20 rule. Go find your long-running jobs and go figure out, hey, can I do some caching, some broadcast joins, some more filtering, reduce skew, things like that. You just, at some point, you might just have to go look at their long-running jobs, see what you can do to speed them up. This, in turn, is going to reduce your compute usage and reduce your Databricks bill by quite a bit. Again, if you're working on multiple hundreds of terabytes of data, one thing to definitely look into is the data types in Delta Lake that you're using. So when you're defining your schemas, making sure you're using good data types, especially for things like joins, because obviously if you're joining on strings on massive hundreds of terabytes data set instead of integers or big ints, stuff like that, it can make a big performance difference. So just make sure you're using the correct data types so you're not casting a bunch, doing a bunch of work in your pipelines. It doesn't need to be like that. Another obvious one that most people miss is lower the cluster inactivity shutdown timeout. This is just a setting that I think defaults is like 120 minutes. Databricks does that, of course they do. So just don't leave a bunch of clusters running that don't need to be running. Turn down that inactivity shutdown time, turn it real low, maybe 15 minutes to make people mad, save a ton of money. And playing off that, go ahead and migrate all your workloads to job clusters. Don't be running production stuff on all-purpose compute and wasting money. Migrate them to job clusters, learn how to use them. We've mentioned this before, but reduce the data size for notebook R&D. If you got data scientists and R&D people, analysts working, show them how to use small data sets to start testing, not huge things while they're burning a ton of money while they're just doing R&D work. Again, I mentioned this one earlier, replace notebook development with local development. There is a way to set up Docker containers so that you can build and test things locally before having to deploy onto a notebook or into the Databricks environment to burn compute when you're just testing and not in production. Teach people how to do local development, and you'll save money. Another great new feature on Databricks and AWS that no one talks about that's a big deal is Fleet Cluster. Databricks Fleet Clusters enable customers to launch clusters using EC2 Spot instances while adopting EC2 Spot best practices by using diversified node types. So basically you can have more than one node type. They call them Fleet Clusters. It's definitely cost savings, and you should use Fleet Clusters if you're not. Another cost-saving tip, definitely check and reduce the size of your disk size on your clusters. This is a configuration for jobs and things. If you're not paying attention, you can just willy-nilly throw things at it. You probably need less than you think. So go ahead and know how big your data sets are, know how much you're spilling to disk, and adjust your disk sizes on your clusters. And also if you're on AWS, definitely go with Spot with fallback for your clusters. Do not use on demand for everything. Use on demand for your driver node, and everything else should be Spot with fallback because it will save you a ton of money on the EC2 cost. And if you're not using auto scaling clusters, you should probably do that because that's just obvious. Now I know nothing was groundbreaking here. These are just good basic common everyday practices that you should be using to save money on Databricks. I mean, honestly, rarely there's a silver bullet that will cut your costs in half, but I think all these things put together really do add up. If you are doing the wrong thing and all these things we talked about, yeah, you're probably spending a good 30% more or more than what you should be. So go ahead, get your basics done right, go through them all, make sure everything's set up properly, and you will save money on Databricks.